All right, we're recording.
All right. Hi there, and welcome to Jacob and Tom's podcast presentation. For this podcast, we'll be diving into the Sandinista protests that took place in Nicaragua from the late 70s into the 80s. These protests sparked American controversy in the Iran-Contra affair, which received mass media attention in the United States. But more importantly, they altered the horizons for the people of Nicaragua, uprooting the dictatorship that had long been subjecting the Nicaraguan working class to inequitable conditions. Here with me on the podcast today is a former Sandinista protester, Tom.
Hello, listeners. It's a pleasure to be here and to share the story of my revolution with all of you. It was a really amazing time in my life.
So let's jump right into it and let's get the listeners up to speed on these protests in your story. In the midst of the economic and social injustice for the lower income population of Nicaragua, the Sandinistas band together to topple the government and create better conditions of living. This revolution, with its methods of organization, instances of violence, and the presence of American intervention, showcased many common themes of Latin American resistance movements. Ultimately, the Sandinistas overthrew the dictatorship and created a revolutionary government, although not without their fair share of trials along the way. So, Tom, first of all, who are the Sandinistas and what motivated them to start a revolution?
Well, Jacob, the Sandinistas are the members of a Nicaraguan military movement that became a political party called the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or briefly FSLN. The FSLN was founded in 1961 by a group of members who were united in part by their commitment to socialism and a rejection of US imperialism. The strong subjection of Nicaragua and its population to the wishes of Somoza, their president, and his private army resulted in the creation of the military movement that intended to defeat the dictatorship. The movement was named after Sandino, and this is how the FLS was born, the FSLN, rather. For us, Sandino was an idol. He was the embodiment of our revolution. He fought against the Americans then, and he had just been too early to see us bring his dream into reality. So we were all motivated to remove the Somoza family from their position of power. This sentiment was shared by many of our members and thus underpinned much of the FSLN's support. And keep in mind, this resistance movement began just after the success of the Cuban Revolution against the military dictatorship of Cuban President Batista. We witnessed those events transpire and used their success as a blueprint for our own movement.
Okay, so the FSLN was founded in the early 1960s. When and how did you first hear about it? And what ultimately motivated you personally to be a part of it?
Well, back in my days at university, I heard the rumblings about the FSLN and their plans for rebuilding a more equal society. And with my poor upbringing, rumors like those always catch your attention in a country where the leaders always seem to keep the rich rich and the poor poor. The first groups I looked into were not actually the FSLN itself, but rather were more important precursors of the FSLN in their emphasis on militant street actions, solidarity with the Cuban Revolution, and independence from both the traditional bourgeois parties and the Communist Party. These groups, such as the Democratic Nicaraguan Youth and the Patriotic Nicaraguan Youth, were made up of students with the goal of starting a revolution to rectify the skewed distribution of wealth in our society at the time. So I first got involved with the Patriotic Nicaraguan Youth early in the 1960s. And when that organization dissolved soon thereafter, some of the members, such as Julio Buitrago and Jose Benito Escobar, became prominent members of the FSLN. And it was individuals like these who convinced me that if the Cubans could manufacture a successful revolution, then why couldn't we?
So let's talk a little about how the Sandinistas went about organizing the movement. The organization of the revolution revolved around using students to gain support throughout the country, and the perceived needs of the Nicaraguan people led to the violence that ensued on their part. Soon enough, as we alluded to earlier, the movement began to gain supporters who were more so against Somoza, since his removal was among the most attractive benefits of a revolt. Some peasants, students, and even big landowners joined in an active form or as accomplices. Students turned universities into vibrant centers of dissent. And once this prompted the regime's continued violence, particularly against students, it only prompted more protests from students. The protesting students were able to transform the response from their state into motivation for other students to join on the revolution. It was a genius move, and capitalizing on the state's response was incredibly successful in encouraging young people to join the FSLN.
Yeah, and it really boiled down to motivating students to accomplish a vision for a society that we had envisioned. We had to use the privilege of a safe environment that we had at university to be able to speak up for those in Nicaragua that really needed our help.
Right. And although you were learning on the fly as young Nicaraguans, you certainly put together a successful organization with many dedicated members. You were able to establish very reliable and firm organizational goals, and your followers were willing to fight and die for the accomplishments of these objectives. One example being within the Sandinistas Creed, where you state that I believe in the people's power in the hands of the workers and peasants and its existence until the end of time. I mean, that in and of itself is a well-crafted dedication to the Sandinista cause and its objectives.
Yes, and it's one of our favorite sayings was always that this revolution goes beyond our borders. Our revolution was always internationalist from the moment Sandino fought his first battle. And more on that saying later, but we did really have a vision for success of our revolution. We may have been following Marxist Leninism, but we sure were doing it with the right way with a strong following.
Right. And that strong following came from the success of your leaders' organizational awareness and decision making. From the beginning, the Sandinistas made noteworthy progress in the social sector, laying a solid foundation for long-term socioeconomic development. Only in Nicaragua has a substantial effort been made to address inequities in land ownership and to extend health, educational, and agricultural services to poor peasant families. Nicaragua was to prove exceptional in the strength of the commitment of the political leadership to improving the condition of the people and encouraging their active participation in the developmental process. They knew that addressing the causes that their support base cared about immediately would bring early success and had very strong methodology and stuck to it. The Sandinistas promoted a mixed economy with heavy participation by the private sector, political pluralism, featuring interclass dialogue and efforts to institutionalize input and feedback from all sectors, ambitious social programs based on large part on grassroots volunteerism, and the maintenance of diplomatic and economic relations with as many nations as possible, regardless of ideology.
And it's clear that creating and maintaining a very clear ideology from the start was one of the many keys to the success of the Sandinistas. It was no wonder that the Americans weren't going to be supportive of a successful example of communism in the Latin Americas. And to the Americans, the threat of good example elicits fear and outrage. It may be a virus that will infect the region and even beyond, undermining the civilized world order. That fear of the spread of communism was much larger than the practicality. And remember what I mentioned earlier about our believing in the borderless nature of our movement? When Borges stated that this revolution transcends national boundaries, he made it entirely clear that he meant ideological transcendence. This does not mean when we export our revolution, we know that it is the people themselves who must make the revolutions. It's not like Nicaraguans had some inner desire to convert the world to their ideology and to change the way that Americans had operated for hundreds of years. We were fighting to change Nicaragua, and our objectives were shared by many, regardless of borders.
Right. So the American interference certainly plays a significant role in this story. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But it seems that as time went by, the anti-Somoza ideology began to embrace revolutionary views while increasing military power and propaganda efforts built a sense of consciousness in the working sectors, universities, and schools. Once he had seen that he had lost his support and was in hot water, Somoza got even more aggressive, and his strategy shifted to using indiscriminate violence. This must not have helped his image whatsoever, did it?
That was really where the thick of the violence was for my people against the Somoza forces. On top of not helping his superficial image, this response against his own people inspired many of my fellow Nicaraguans to take up arms against Somoza.
So, Tom, let me ask you, was the violence on the part of the Sandinistas necessary in this case? Consider the resistance movements led by students in Mexico, for example. They faced very similar challenges when it came to resisting the government, and they used similar tactics to be able to counter the counter-revolution from their government. They, much like the Nicaraguan students, got ahead of the narrative and defined themselves as nationalists, fighting for what they believed. The use of nonviolence and silent demonstration challenged media and government views that the students were being foreign-led and out of control. The silence that the Mexican students adopted was a form of protest. And you mentioned that the Cuban Revolution was your guide for how to conduct a successful protest. Why not adopt something less violent?
Well, by using their strengths, both the Mexican and Nicaraguan students created their own narrative and used the state's response to build up their own cause. Remember, the Cuban Revolution occurred just years before I got involved with the patriotic Nicaraguan youth and then following the FSLN. We got to witness its success, and since it directly inspired us, we wanted to follow their tried and true methods to some extent. And let me preface this by saying that this tendency was to our own detriment in many respects. It was our belief that entering into an armed struggle would lead to a mass revolution in short order. We did not take our time in analyzing both the parallels and the differences between our situation and that of the Cubans during the 50s. This led us to assume a timeline for success that was not possible given our different circumstances. For example, the Cubans had a vast communications network at their disposal that far exceeded our own capabilities. I mean, in our 17 years of guerrilla warfare, we didn't have so much as a radio transmitter with which to communicate. So the reality is, the military accomplishments of the Cuban Revolution would just not have been possible for us to duplicate. Now, with that being said, every revolution can be analyzed and picked apart in hindsight, and that doesn't delegitimize the needs of the individuals who took part in that resistance movement. So I would maintain that while we didn't handle every situation perfectly, the violence on our part was completely justified given our circumstances. It was simply a response to our direct set of circumstances under the Somoza regime.
And just the fact, too, that even with the guerrilla warfare, it took decades to achieve success, one must wonder whether it would have even been possible in a more peaceful manner. At that point, the Somoza family and the Nicaraguan elite had been taking advantage of the poor working class for your entire lifetime. So even if violence wasn't ultimately necessary to overthrow them, which is hard to determine, we've seen time after time that violence can expedite the expulsion of those who commit human rights violations. So I agree that it was justified in this particular case. Building from their roots as a student organized protest, violence ended up securing the power for the group.
Exactly. And it really did become a move of necessity. For us, our protest sparked state responsive violence. Then it was time that we finally took our cause into our own hands. Perhaps if the government had not been so quick to violence, things would not have escalated to the level that they did. But this is not something we'll ever know. What did happen, however, was that through our own use of violence, we won the country. When all the smoke had cleared, there were no more National Guard forces in the area, and Nicaragua's military was made up of completely Sandinistas.
Indeed, and we've seen this sort of necessity of violence before in Latin American revolution. In particular, when revolution came to the barrios of Venezuela. In Venezuela, the impoverished communities were fighting for economic equality. And when the government lashed out against its citizens with violence, the response was also necessary for the people there too. The people that lived in the barrios banded together against the unfair treatment that they received from the government. And while their efforts were not as fruitful as the violence from the Sandinistas, the use and rationale of violence was nearly identical. When a government power took a step too far in trying to smother protests, the people began to fight for what they believed in and utilized violence as a means to the end of accomplishing their movement's goals.
And it was after all this violence that we took it upon ourselves to engage in some military defensive strategy and equip ourselves because We were then worried about a foreign, particularly American, direct intervention in our own country.
Hmm. And we know that the assassination of Somoza and the change of power within Nicaragua was far from the end of the story. Once in control, the FSLN took immediate preparatory measures to defend their claim to power. The FSLN consolidated the revolution politically by promoting the growth of grassroots organizations, reorganizing the Sandinista armed forces, and equipping them with standardized military apparel.
Yeah, at that point, we had that taste of victory, and we weren't going to let anyone, foreign or domestic, steal our success away from us. As soon as we had won the country, emphasis was placed on military preparedness. Once we had established this grasp, it was time to, as the Americans say, win the hearts and minds.
Speaking of the Americans, we know that they played a big role in the development of Nicaragua in the years following the successful overthrow of Somoza. Once he was long gone, Nicaragua started to lose its ties with the United States. In 1985, the government of the United States dictated a commercial embargo to Nicaragua, supported by the fact that Nicaragua adopted a pro-communist attitude. The US threatened the Nicaraguan government several times with military intervention. Nevertheless, the international opinion discreetly supported the revolutionary government when the secret Contra funding by the US government was discovered. Did this US intervention come as a surprise to you at all?
This was no surprise at all. The US has a long history of meddling in Latin American affairs, and in this case, with the Marxist and Leninist values that we held, there was no way that we were escaping American intervention and attention. As soon as they saw what we had accomplished, there was no getting away with it on their watch. We really needed a unified front to stand against the resistance that we received, which was supported by the United States. Out of necessity, we fought for our organization, and we weren't going to be pushed around when it came to our beliefs.
The extent to which the US sought to bring you down, though, was unprecedented, no? They implemented a multifaceted approach to dismantling the results of the Sandinista revolution. A campaign of propaganda led to the dissemination of misinformation about the state of affairs in Nicaragua. Even from the start, at the onset of the newfound Sandinista control of Nicaragua, when Jimmy Carter was still in office in the US, they were already attempting to gain influence over you by providing economic support in the hopes of manipulating the future of Nicaragua into a form of government that they found acceptable. And soon after, in the late 1980s, when Reagan took office and expressed his disgust of the Marxist Sandinista takeover, vowing to cease all aid effective immediately, you were depicted as a totalitarian communist regime and an instrument of Soviet expansionism. And that just wasn't the truth.
Well, you're right in many ways. You are right, Jacob, but I disagree with the statement that these actions were unprecedented. The fact is, just as we saw in the decades prior, the parallels between Cuba and Nicaragua only go so far. In Nicaragua, we had attempted to impose a dogmatic Marxist-Leninist system. We would have been met with an abundance of opposition, and many would have fled the country. As time went on, we were forced to depend more and more on the socialist bloc for trade and aid, due in part to the actions of the US. But far from being unprecedented, the US actually made use of methods that they had successfully implemented in the past to destroy Latin American regimes that didn't align perfectly with their ideology, starting with their efforts in curtailing all economic aid.
That's true. And it just gets worse from there. The US took advantage of their position with the banks, mainly the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, to prevent Nicaragua from acquiring multilateral loans that they were in desperate need of. You see, the Sandinistas were committed to honoring the debts of Somoza, making the efforts of the US significant. And this triggered a cascade effect as Nicaragua's inability to pay back Mexico and Venezuela, for example, to those countries' satisfaction, caused those countries to withhold much of their oil, forcing Nicaragua to rely on the USSR for petroleum. So in that sense, the results of the United States efforts were counter to their goals. And if that wasn't enough, Reagan then authorized an expense of roughly $20 million to form a paramilitary force to disrupt Nicaraguan development. This counter-revolutionary onslaught led to the destruction of crucial infrastructure such as bridges and oil refineries.
Yes, and these events led to a great deal of hardships in Nicaragua. We were forced to increase our defense budget to account for all of these attacks. Since we already faced financial concerns, the increase in defense funds came at the expense of the social services, such as health, education, housing, and even food subsidies. And the Contras were relentless, committing inhumane acts such as destroying schools, clinics, daycare centers, and food supplies. Despite all of this, support for the Sandinista government could not be extinguished. In fact, based on the number of members of pro-Sandinista grassroots organizations, our support seems to have increased during this time.
And while the Sandinista government may have gained more support, the fact remains that there was an imminent need for economic relief. So the US effectively altered the immediate needs of the Nicaraguan people inorganically, knowing that they would eventually respond once again to their immediate circumstances as they had earlier. To many in Nicaragua, something had to give, and 14 parties actually banded together to form the United Nicaraguan Opposition, or the UNO. And this organization promised to fix the economic difficulties that the country faced. The US pumped upwards of $9 million to support the UNO. The reality is due in large part to the fact that the UNO was simply an amalgamation of differing parties that opposed the FSLN. Their organization was rather disorganized compared to the FSLN.
That it was, and to be honest, it surprised a lot of us when the UNO defeated the FSLN in the 1990 elections. But that wasn't the end of our story. We remain today the largest Nicaraguan political party.
That's incredible. It's really a testament to the resistance of the FSLN. The odds were stacked against you from the start, yet the movement that you helped start some 50 years ago is still impacting the country today.
Well, we really believed in and were passionate about what we were doing, and were effective in our methods of organization. I think those were some of the keys for a successful revolution movement.
I agree. You took part in a truly fascinating piece of Latin American history, overcoming many of the challenges that were common to Latin American resistance movements. The Sandinistas displayed how much can be accomplished through well-organized movements and the role that violence can play in them. Surviving the often violent pushback of both the Somoza regime and the US, the Sandinistas accomplished a feat that can give hope to those seeking to make a social change. With uniformity in motives, whether that be ideological or based on immediate circumstances, and a passion for the goals of the movement, significant changes can be made by anyone. Tom, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jacob. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for having me on.